Hello, and thanks for joining us for this session of Cogent Thoughts. I'm Brett Watson, and today we're honored to have as our guest Dr. Cyrus Zargar, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Central Florida, author of 3 books, 2 on Sufi Islamic thought and practice, and most recently, The Polished Mirror, an introduction to the 2 major ethical traditions of Islam. Dr. Zargar also has several published articles covering a range of Islamic studies, and I'm privileged personally to have Dr. Zargar as my teacher in my own Islamic studies. Also joining us is my good friend Chris Lemaster, professional bloviator and consummate devil's advocate. So he'll be chiming in from time to time, I hope, anyway. He's really a very logical guy, and he thinks of things that I don't think of.
Yeah,
so,
that's good.
Yeah.
Just a minor point. So the 3rd book is on its way. The Polished Mirror was the 2nd book. Yeah. I don't know if it matters.
What's the 3rd book?
The 3rd book I'm finishing up this year. It's on a Sufi Persian poet, Attar, Fariduddin Attar. It's called Religion of Love. And I am looking at all of it's like the collection of pretty much his whole corpus of poetry. And I'm trying to think about, well, what can it tell us about the study of religion?
That sounds really good.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. So thanks for being with us, though, today. And
thank you for having me.
What we want to talk about, to give you a little bit of background, we have a class that we do on Thursday evenings, and currently the topic has been around relationships, and most recently relationships with God and how that differs from relationships with people, obviously.
Right.
And what I noticed were a lot of questions coming up about different religious perspectives on this topic. So I thought, I'm going to ask Dr. Zargar if he would be willing to be interviewed on this topic. So we want to discuss with you the Islamic thoughts on this idea of a personal relationship with God and people, and the similarities and the differences between Islamic thinking on the topic and Judeo-Christian perspectives. Yeah. So I want to begin with a subject of personal interest.
Please.
I have been super intrigued by the Sufi branch of Islamic thought since studying under your colleague, Dr. Michael Knight, Western Mysticism. So, what can you tell us about Sufism and its contribution to this topic?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Sufism actually developed out of an interest within the first few centuries of Islam to have, you might say, a relationship with God. I mean, that might be a good way to put it. And, early on the trend was toward asceticism, renouncing the world. And in fact, certain people became known for wearing woolen clothing, which is much less comfortable than cotton.
Sure.
And it's the clothes of the renunciant.
That's what I was going to ask you, actually, if this is like the renunciate movement within Islam.
Well, it's one of them. But it somehow through the course of history wins out and absorbs the other renunciant movements. And so in Arabic, wool is suf. And so Sufi, one who wears wool, that sort of became a term associated with, we can say this group, with others too, but then this group sort of took it as their own. And they were localized mostly in Baghdad, in modern-day Iraq. Also in nearby in Basra and other places. But kind of a fascinating thing happens, which is that you have other similar movements, or other movements, if not similar, with similar interests in, like what is the path to God? How does one, perfect their spiritual practice? And eventually most of those become associated with Sufism. So Sufism becomes a really kind of umbrella term for a lot of different pious movements in Islam. Yeah. And then it develops, and you get Sufi orders, with particular masters and a chain of masters that goes back to the Prophet Muhammad, and it lives today.
So this would be, these orders would be similar to maybe what some Christians know as apostolic succession?
Yes. Except if my understanding of apostolic succession is correct, it's like it's linear, whereas here you can have multiple valid lines of spiritual succession going back to the Prophet Muhammad, and they can recognize each other and be, it's because it's not necessarily some sort of, end all authority. It's spiritual training.
Gotcha.
The issue of succession I'd put in a different category. I mean, there's real important debates about succession in Islam, but I'd put that in the Sunni Shi'i Ibadi category. So when you hear, and that's just a different way of looking at Islam than to talk about these early pious movements. Okay,
actually that makes sense, since they seem to belong to what you might call the mystic category of spirituality. And so not so concerned with hierarchy and that sort of thing. Is that a fair statement?
Well, they could be. It depended on the time and place. So the comparison I'd make is like to the Catholic orders, monastic orders, Franciscan, Benedictine, all that.
Sure.
It's like a different formula for success that traces itself back to a certain person. But at the same time, you could be very political and involved in one of these orders.
Okay.
So it's kind of odd. Like it's because what ends up happening is, I would say like in the 1300s and 1400s and 1500s, the Sufi orders become very politically powerful, many of them, and spread out throughout the Muslim majority world. But there were also times of quietism, or orders that favored quietism. So it kind of depends.
Because I remember a conversation that I had with, or a chat conversation with Dr. Knight about, it was a question that I asked him around fundamentalism and its influence within Islam, and he was correcting me. I didn't know that it was really the Sufis that had so much political influence earlier on. Am I remembering that right?
At times they did. So it really depends on what century you're talking about. So when you remember that early period I was talking about with Baghdad, that period of Sufism, let's say the 800s, Common Era. They weren't all that politically influential. But what happens is by around the 1100s, 1200s, you have certain leaders who will let's say, get their authority by associating themselves with a Sufi saint. So the Sufi saint will, in a way, kind of recognize them, and there's a reciprocal relationship between the saint or the master and the ruler.
Okay.
And then that develops. And when I was talking about that period in the 1400s and 1500s, I mean, so the Ottomans, they're affiliated with the Sufi order. They're not a Sufi order themselves, but they have Sufi allegiances, and so Sufism ends up spreading really wherever the Ottoman Empire spreads.
Okay.
But then at the same time, like in Iran, you have a Sufi order, the Safavid Sufi order, that becomes like a militarized Sufi order, and they basically take over Iran. Yeah. So like that's a later development, but that's why it's hard to say. It depends on at one point in history. You put your pin down, and you can see Sufism fulfilling a different role politically.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, do you think that the spread of their influence had much to do with their focus on personal relationship with God?
I think so. I mean, what Sufism offers are a number of things. Number one, it offers a kind of a charted path to spiritual perfection and knowing God. And it's just nice to know that someone has that. Mm-hmm. It's like if you think about the interest that that any of us might have in a self-help book. The idea behind the self-help book is this person's been through some things. They found a way, to become in one aspect of their lives complete. And now they've written about it and they've charted it out for me,
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is there is a claim of kind of like a spiritual genealogy going back to the Prophet Muhammad and then back to God. And so there is that kind of authority, right? And that is going to appeal to people as well.
Yeah.
And then the third thing is communal cultural. So if you're living in a city or a place where Sufism is prevalent and they're having, like they might be having this week, a big celebration for the Prophet Muhammad, right, which is associated with Sufism, but it's a worldwide phenomenon. But a big celebration for the Prophet Muhammad, why wouldn't you want to join in? Or they're having a session with the music and the poetry. It's very, it offers a lot culturally. And so that's another reason why, Sufism would be.
So when you say that it's worldwide, like a worldwide celebration, do you mean that Sunnis and Shia Muslims would join in on something like that, even if they don't designate themselves as Sufi?
Well, you have hit on it's a contentious point, but we can go into it. Why not? That's why we're here.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the celebration of the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad. So I would say for a long period of time, it was a worldwide phenomenon. Sunni, Shi'i, and not especially Sufi. Those, Sufis did it well. There was there was poetry and all that, but it wasn't just a Sufi thing at all.
Okay.
Now, in the modern era, you get a pushback against practices that are perceived as not originating in the time of the Prophet Muhammad.
Which era was it?
In the modern era. So let's say starting from the late 1800s.
Okay.
Or starting from the mid to late 1800s especially. And more and more so as we move to the present. You have this interest in, how shall we say, having a pure original form of Islam that is the Islam of the Prophet and the people that knew him and lived around him. That was always a concern that Muslims had, but not in the same. It didn't have the same kind of interest in sort of getting rid of practices that were deemed as like innovations and imports. And the celebration of the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, because there isn't real strong evidence that the Prophet Muhammad and the people around him actually celebrated his birthday. Right? They didn't, as far as we know, do that.
There were no paintings of a cake and blowing out candles.
No, there's no party.
Okay.
I mean, the idea, or even the idea of celebrating birthdays, So because of that, there becomes this idea. Well, this is a kind of a heretical innovation. Okay. Well, there's problems with that perspective too. I mean, can you realistically recreate a religion and a set of practices from, the early 600s? That's point one. Point two, what is the meaning and message behind celebrating of the Prophet Muhammad's birthday? There is a big there's a lot of literature about the blessings and the beauty of the Prophet Muhammad's being born. So what is wrong with people finding an occasion to be happy about that, having a kind of communal, celebration, families get together, people give gifts. Why is that a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's a debate that's going on right now among Muslims.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, you have the more, I'd say, I want to use this word puritanical, but I don't want to offend anybody. And on the other hand, you have what I would call
spoken like a university professor.
Yeah. On the other hand, you have the more, I would say, traditional. So I would say it's more traditional Islam to celebrate the Prophet Muhammad's birthday because it's something that's been done over the centuries.
Okay.
But then, it's kind of a reformist, let's call it that, a reformist point of view that we should not. Sorry, you were going to say something, and I was finishing that thought.
Yeah, I don't remember what it was, though.
Apologize, yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. All right, well, let's that's really fascinating stuff. Maybe we can do this again because I really I love the history, and it's really interesting to me, and I like seeing picking up on the parallels that I see in the history of the church.
Right.
It seems that, and maybe this is what I was going to ask, actually. It seems like the further we get from, the origins of a religion, the more we see these more fundamentalist, less tolerant groups popping up that want to preserve the original product, so to speak. And you definitely see that in Christianity in the 19th century when fundamentalism is kind of like formulated and in response to the Enlightenment and scientific revolution, that sort of thing. So you think that's what was occurring there, or what is occurring still?
That's a really good question. I mean, so there's two things. One, Brett, is your observation, your really astute observation that there's a parallel between, let's say, this, Christian reformist movements and Islamic ones, and all of them throughout the world. Mm-hmm. And the reason is they're all reacting to the same thing. So if you think about like a Christian at the time of the Enlightenment, or even more a Christian today, and you think about whatever you want to call that thing out there, call it modernity, call it this capitalistic, technological mode of being that seems irresistible. That's the part of it, is that it seems irresistible, and it sort of just pervades everything. It has this way of taking over every culture, right?
Yes.
That's what your conservative Christian is going to react to. Mm-hmm. And honestly, justifiably so.
Yeah, at least in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, at least in some ways. I mean, there's a way of life that they see as disappearing. Mm-hmm. And there seems to be nothing that you can do about it because it's being replaced by a new set of values, a new set of technologies, and honestly, one that just seems less interested in, at times, less interested in, devotion, religious practice, asceticism, classic Christian.
So is that the only
values?
Is that the only reason that it's justified then? Because I struggle with saying why it's justified even.
Okay. I'm saying that the fear has some justification behind it. I'm not saying that the reaction is justified. Okay. The concern is justified. Good. I'm glad. Thank you for the clarification. The concern that something's disappearing. It seems to be, right? Mm-hmm. Well, now imagine that the change isn't coming from within your own culture and your own society, the way it is in America and in Europe. But imagine that it's coming from outside. All of a sudden you have these French soldiers in Cairo. And you're being told there's this whole new way of eating using silverware, which was like this new thing, in the 1700s. And you have this new way of dressing, and every element of your culture seems to be, and your religion seems to be under some kind of attack. And an attack here would be the right word, because this time it wasn't something that happened from within. Again, it was something that's being imposed upon you.
Right, and it was militant.
And it was militant, and now it's happening in different pockets all over, and then you have the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and then so on one side, I think that's what's led to a really visceral pushback against what's deemed as modernity. And you can see it because very often the reformist, or if you want to say fundamentalist, or whatever the word is, if you're talking about this certain type of religious person, the things that make them most antsy are the ones that look the most Western, or I'm talking about within like non-Western Muslim majority countries, the ones that, so for example, there becomes this really, really this real interest in modes of dress, of the way women dress, especially, that people weren't all that concerned with before, but nothing, it just would strike you as very Western and, non-traditional for women to come out of their house dressed completely different, and so then the hijab becomes this big issue that wasn't an issue before.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm doing a long answer, but so just real quick, second part. There were other times in Islamic history where you had what I would call, you had some pretty, I'm trying to think of the right word, but I can't remember the word you used, but you might want to say fundamentalist kind of movements where, at least iconoclastic.
Okay.
And even very early in Islam, there was one called the Khawarij. And they believed that by force of arms, they had this kind of circumspect, this very, very closed worldview that they imposed. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So Sufism, is it fair to say that Sufism? Well, you did say that it arose from this concern with relating to God, being in relationship with God. Right. Now, it also seems, although I hadn't heard before that there was this militant group within Sufism, but it seems that, as I've read the little bit that I have from Sufi mystics, that they share a lot in common with mystics from other faiths or wisdom traditions.
That's right.
So you would agree then that they share a unique degree of unity, mystics do, these mystical branches of religion, when it comes to theology and devotional practice?
Okay. That's a really good question. So first thing is, the Sufis actually share things even with other Muslims who have a kind of interest in the hidden elements, the hidden aspect, the interior part of religion.
Yeah.
Because you have other movements even within Islam that you wouldn't call Sufi, but their interest in the interior, whether you can call it the heart or even like hidden meanings of the Quran. Mm-hmm. So like in you have it in Shiism, in Shia Islam, and actually one of the first like a major interpretation of Islam that advocated the interior or hidden meaning is Ismaili Shiism. But then you also have it in among philosophers and other Sunni pious movements that I said became kind of absorbed by Sufism. But then when you reach beyond Islam, I think you see a lot of parallels. So much so that when you're studying Sufism, sometimes it especially if you're studying what I would call theoretical Sufism,
okay,
that has to do with the cosmos and God's revelation of himself to the, as a kind of mode of being, and the soul and the unity of the soul with God, the union of the soul with God. And you start to look at them, and then you start to see the parallels. You start to see the parallels between, Vedic Indian philosophy. You start to see the parallels between that and Neoplatonic thought and philosophy, or Christian, Jewish mysticism. Mm-hmm. It becomes this difficult process. Are all these people coming upon the same realities on their own, or is there some historical relationship where they're borrowing ideas from each other, or is it a mixture? Or is it a mixture of both? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tend toward hard, that.
Yeah. The mixture of both?
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too, actually. Makes the most sense. Yeah. I mean, some things are uncanny, like, when there's the most interesting is when there's no historical connection or relationship, and but there's a similar, we might say, discovery.
Like what though? That would be interesting. What do you mean?
Union. I mean, you can say what you want about mystical union, but I think that's why it's received so much study, is that it's just there's such a common language among those right. who have said to have experienced it.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it's real. I'm not saying that it's not real. I'm just saying that there's enough in common there that there seems to be something going on, and people have pushed back against that and said, well, no, they're not alike at all. Each one happens in its own religious tradition, its own way, and I see that. But there's been enough in common for people to at least build theories and try to put them together,
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain a little further what you mean by mystical union?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's an idea that a person can arrive at this place, can achieve this state where they lose their sense of selfhood. Now, there's different versions of this. Sometimes they maintain their sense of selfhood, but they feel a kind of unity with the universe. But sometimes they lose their sense of selfhood, and they kind of like everything just disappears. And there's this, sometimes described like a sense of nothingness, sometimes described as a sense of everythingness. I mean, it depends on which tradition you go to.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a really generic way of describing a phenomenon that you find in Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity,
Well, and you find
Judaism.
I would say you find it outside of religion itself, though, as well. There's those who claim to not be religious, but they still practice meditation type things, near-death experiences, hallucinogens, things
Use of
along
psychedelics,
those. And ego deaths usually within psychedelics usually lead to that one of everything or nothing or a unity like that.
Well, you're completely right, and I agree. In fact, there's a psychologist, William James, who like recreated mystical experience using psychedelics, and that was really the birth of the like psychological approach to studying union. So there's a real good chance when I say that it's a real phenomenon, that it's there's people would argue that it's a psychological phenomenon, that it's something within the human brain. That's been one approach.
Yeah. Since we don't have proof for mine as I know of right now for like mass hallucination type things, does that still fall into the category? Like, why would I have the same experience as someone halfway across the world, 1,500 years ago doing meditation?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, it points to, so it depends on who you ask. I mean, if you're asking those who favor the psychological approach, obviously, you have the similar brains. And so the process would be similar in that way. But I think if you're asking the person who's experienced it or those who see these as realities, there's some sort of interaction with something transcendent that is common to these religious traditions, or not even non-religious traditions, as you pointed out.
Well, and at what point? At what point does it matter? If it is just a psychological brain chemistry makeup, but everyone who has done it or has experienced that says, no, there's something more, then even if it is just a setup of chemistry within the brain, once you experience it, does that change your reality? Does that change a view of your perception of reality? And so therefore making it real at that point?
Yeah, I think so.
I agree. Yeah, I think so too.
The other, this is straying a little bit from the topic, but
sorry.
When you
no, it's really interesting.
When you consider the evidence that near-death experiences provide, it's not something repeatable and observable, but unless people volunteer someday to be killed and then report their experiences, but nevertheless, people have these experiences, and one of the common reports is that they are conscious when we know that, as far as the brain is concerned, they cannot be conscious. They even recall things that occurred in, let's say, the emergency room when there's no way they could have had consciousness, or in surgery where they're under anesthesia. They show no brain activity once dead. So when you think about that evidence and then the parallel experiences of mystics or psychedelic users or whatever, maybe it's just such a thing that the brain serves as a governor for consciousness rather than what creates consciousness. That consciousness is not an emergent property of the brain.
And I guess tying the point back in, I think, is some people do, but everything boils down to a chemical reaction of some kind. At least I believe so. And but nonetheless, I'm happy. Doesn't matter what endorphins or whatever is going on in my brain. I'm happy. That doesn't change my reality. You can tell me all day long that no, you're not really happy. It's just these chemicals released.
Yeah, who cares?
Well,
yeah, that's.
And so if I have this connection with this deity, this creator, and I have this intimate relationship, can you really debate it just because saying, oh, well, it's actually just chemicals and how your brain works? Does that make it any less real, though?
Yeah, and I think I agree. It's the word just, right? Mm-hmm. Why just chemicals? Right. I mean, if there is some creator who wants you to have an experience of himself, and everything leading up to the mystical experience was done through chemicals. I mean, you needed your eyes, you needed your ears. Everything was part of the normal order of creation.
Yeah, they're just means.
They're just means. So why wouldn't even the highest levels of cognizance and the realization of that also be done through some sort of means, namely the means of the brain and its chemistry? I mean, you're always embodied. You're always going to be in this body as long as you're alive. And so anything that happens to you is going to have some sort of measurable, natural counterpart to it. It doesn't. I don't see it as dismissing it personally.
I don't either.
And if you've known have you guys known someone who's had a near-death experience?
Yes,
I have too. And it's different when they tell you, because I think your reaction to it is different. You're much less inclined to dismiss it.
Yes. When you
hear it from them. Personally.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing what they tell you they've seen, and there's no way they could have known.
Right.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm just saying, it would, why not look into these things and take them seriously? I mean, maybe people are. I don't know.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name now, but there is a group of doctors. Unfortunately it's a fairly small group. They're not. They only have these experiments set up in a relatively small number of surgical centers and emergency rooms. Do you remember where?
Yeah, it was specifically in the cardiac departments,
right,
and some hospitals, and the experiment's actually over.
It is.
Yeah, they did all their studies, but they had so few monitors and setups that they didn't have enough data to have a reliable test.
So what they were doing is they set up in these rooms monitors high enough that nobody in the room could see what was going on in the monitors, but because they had experienced this group of doctors had experienced so many of these NDEs where that people described, floating up to the top of the room and watching everything going on. Mm-hmm. They thought, well, we'll just have these monitors going with strange images that would be memorable, and see if anybody comes back and describes this image that they see on this monitor.
That's kind of a weird way to do it, though.
You think?
Don't you think? Yeah, because maybe they should have consulted with someone who studies like the esoteric and the hidden sciences. But the soul at the moment of death, or even if you want to say after the moment of death or at the moment of death, has its own concerns. You can't direct it to be interested in something that's on a screen necessarily. It probably will be more interested in its loved ones or its looming fate.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a good insight. Yeah, so there really was only one guy that made it to what they call the third level of the interview process, and he did not remember any of the images, although he did have an outer body experience. But it's still I don't know how else you could hope to gather any empirical evidence for something like this, though. I thought it was pretty smart that way.
I think the idea is, it's nifty. I mean, it's a cool little idea. I just think that it doesn't seem to really get what's going on here. If you're going to go on with the experiment, at least having the idea that there might be something real going on here, I think should be a part of it. And then maybe do something like, instead of having an experiment, like just collect, like a kind of a worldwide, and I'm just coming up with this on the spot, but like a worldwide attempt to take every account and then interview people who were there and see what's really going on. Instead of trying to like impose, like, okay, we're going to put some image there and see. I don't know.
Well, that much has been done, though.
Yeah.
They have,
yeah, has it?
Yeah, there's a collection. I believe it's in the tens of thousands now of these experiences that have been documented.
Okay.
And comparisons done, but
they
definitely
like a library.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the University of maybe Virginia has an ongoing discussion over all this stuff. Anyway,
I'd love to learn more about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I just want to say a little something here, because we've been talking about Sufism and mysticism, and I just want to make sure that there's something kind of clear, which is that, I agree that that you can study parts of Sufism under the category of comparative mysticism, but Sufism is not mysticism.
Okay.
You have there's a lot of practices that really have nothing to do with mystical union. There's Sufism, and the problem with the category of mysticism is that there's all these other labels that go onto it, like, oh well, it's not worldly, it's not political, it's not. So I just want to say that you can study parts of Sufism and other Islamic traditions as having mystical elements or being part of. You can study within the context of comparative mysticism, but just so that I'm clarifying on my end that they're not necessarily one and the same. And I'm not saying that you said that. I just have to clarify that. Just
no, but that's good. That does clarify things for me, because I did kind of, you talk about mystics within Islamic thought, you talk about Sufism. That's what I thought. So, no, that's interesting.
No, I mean, you have even Sufis who are, I would say, Sufis who are not mystics. Like, they're just not interested in that part of it. Like, when I'm talking about mysticism, I'm really interested in like the issues that come up in comparative mysticism, like the issue of union that we were talking about.
Yeah.
But anyways, let's keep going.
All right. So this is really interesting to me. So I wanted to talk more about this in a recent lecture that you gave on the Quranic view of Mary, where she's very prominent.
Right.
More prominent in the Quran than in the New Testament, even, really.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the mother of Jesus here. I was really struck by how similar, at least what you gave us in that, it wasn't a lecture on this, but how similar the Christology seemed between Islamic and Christian thought. So can you expound on this Islamic view of Jesus as the Word of God, and whatever similarities and differences there are with John's concept of the Logos in his gospel account?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I've like, when it comes to you can help me when it comes to, if you don't mind, with with John's reading of how it worked. So the Quran, the Quran just sort of has these references to Jesus, and I can't remember how many there are. In my mind, there are at least two, where Jesus is described as a word from God. And I wonder if that's the difference, a word versus the word. But one explanation, and to me the one that makes the most sense, is that it has to do with the nature of Jesus's creation, the way that Jesus came to be. Which is to say that he was really, you might want to say, divinely revealed into Mary's womb, without the intermediary of a human father. And because of that, he, according to, like, I study this actually Sufi figure, Ibn al-Arabi. So according to him and others, he bears, you might want to say, angelic or spiritual qualities even in his life. Now, when you get to what the nature of angels, what really makes them special or different is that they're made of what's called sometimes pure light. They have this, there's nothing really connecting them to the lower realms. So that when God commands, it happens for them. They do it. Mm-hmm. It's not that they're compelled to. It's that it's in their very nature.
Okay.
Simply to carry out God's commands. They are God's commands personified.
Okay.
Okay? And so Jesus has that quality. And because he has that quality, you'll see within him something otherworldly. He's not interested in worldly things. So there's a narration. There's sayings describing Jesus as his pillow was a rock. He had no interest in worldly things. He would fast continuously. He has this otherworldly way that he carries around with him. But then also, he has this amazing ability to give life. He brings life with him wherever he goes. He blows into a clay figure of a bird and it comes to life. He raises the dead. He heals the blind. And all these are from Islamic literature. I know that there are parallels in the Gospels.
Yeah.
But I'm not even talking about those.
Okay.
I'm talking about in Islamic literature. Well,
so
why
the bird,
is that?
Sorry.
Yeah.
So the bird, I want to say that comes from the Gospel of Thomas, which is not a canonical gospel, but that's interesting that they have that story in Islamic literature.
Well, actually, the thing is, because I go to these conferences for religious studies, and I've worked in religion departments. I've had friends who do Bible studies and academic biblical studies and things like that. And when we talk, they can often find in the Apocrypha parallels to the stories in the Quran and apocryphal accounts.
Yeah. And that makes sense, I guess, because that literature was circulating, 1-2 centuries after Christianity started. So
though
some of that would have been available. And from the Islamic perspective, really all Scripture is trying to get to the divine word, and the truth of that word from the Quranic perspective comes out in the Quran as a kind of clarification on what came before. So really the Quran, from a Quran perspective, it's presenting you with the authoritative version of Jesus, let's say. So it confirms what came before. Actually, this is pretty much a quote from the Quran. It confirms what came before, in a sense. That's why Muhammad's called the seal of the prophets. A seal in the old in the olden days, you had a ring. I don't know if you can see a ring in the camera. You had a ring with a special insignia on it, and you'd put it in wax and you'd close the letter. Right. So what does the seal do? It closes it, meaning he's the last prophet. So the Prophet Muhammad is the seal of the prophet. He's the last prophet. But it also verifies it as belonging to the king. It confirms. So anyways, so that's why Jesus is called Ruhullah, the Spirit of God. So each prophet has a name. Each of the major prophets has a name. Abraham is Khalilullah, God's friend. Moses is Kalimullah, he who spoke with God, he who had conversations with God. Jesus is Ruhullah. Muhammad is the Spirit of God. Muhammad is Habibullah, the beloved of God. I skipped Noah, he's another famous one. Nabiullah, the prophet of God. But I hope that explains. I don't want to keep going. No, that's good.
Yeah.
I just when I heard you say in the lecture that Jesus is described as the Word of God, or a Word of God, I guess, that just stuck out to me. Because John's kind of more esoteric approach to his gospel. There's a lot to interpret there, but Jesus is depicted there as the Logos, borrowing from Greek thought. The idea that Jesus is the personification of, I guess you could say, the creative mind of God. And so, and I think it's important for Christians to understand too that even the Nicene Fathers in their creed, development of the creed, most people don't notice this, but when they say that Jesus is the Son of God, co-equal with the Father, God from God, light from light, and so on. They say co-equal in substance, as if to say that the qualities of God are personified in Jesus. And so it struck me when you brought this up in the lecture that there's some similarities there.
Oh yeah, there really are. Yeah. And the other remember in the Islamic tradition, there's another word of God, and in fact, it's the primary sort of word of God in Islamic practice, which is the Quran. So in many interpretations of what the Quran is, it is the purest form of God's words in scriptural form. Like that idea that it's God's word is what has at different times been taken very, very seriously, like down to the letter, divinely revealed. So that's why I like to use the term revelation when it comes to Jesus. He's a revelation,
Yeah.
In the Islamic perspective.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, did you know that there are a lot of parallels there between the story of Jesus' birth in the Quran and the story of the birth of the Buddha?
No.
It's really pretty amazing.
With the speech part?
Yes.
See, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I've never heard that.
And he walks around and he gives a little sermonette on the fact that he's the Buddha.
But is it a similar thing? I mean, so there's a whole genre of literature about Mary being charged for suspected, of inappropriate behavior.
Yeah,
and then you'll see in the Christian literature, I think it's apocryphal text, like this whole, like, how does she prove it? That's the question.
Yeah.
And I can't remember. There's these other scenarios where she proves, her chastity. I can't remember exactly what were the other scenarios, but is it a similar thing to that, or is it just, is it more like the rank of Buddha? Like he's like, this is me.
Yeah, it's more about that. There was no scandalous, pregnancy there or anything, but it is interesting that in the Buddhist myth that she has this dream that a white elephant enters her side, and then she's pregnant. So it's kind of a divine conception.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Cool stuff.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So an obvious difference between the notion of the Christian notion that God became a man, that's an obvious difference between Islamic thought on Jesus and Christian thought. And of course, I'm sure you know that the doctrine of the incarnation is very central to Christian theology, and I would say that it's also to the idea of God's relatability. So you have, like in the book of Hebrews, the author goes to great lengths to show that God is made relatable through Jesus. He had to have flesh and blood so that he could be the merciful high priest that could relate to the temptations of the flesh and that kind of thing. And Chris had asked, when he saw that question, he asked, well, is the relatability that the mythos of God becoming man, that what it provides for Christianity from an Islamic standpoint, is that really important concerning God's relatability, or is it something that Christianity offers that the Islamic faith does not? How would you say that God is made relatable to humans?
Can I clarify?
Yeah.
Okay, so in the you use the word the Christian mythos of that, and that's where I can agree, because it's hard for me to just take that Jesus is the Son of God, that he is this reincarnation of God, and for me it's even hard to find value in that. But if it's just in the story, if it's just in the Christian scriptures that, look, this is a myth, like it has meaning behind it, it being actually real doesn't have much meaning behind it. It's the story that's being told. And so that's what I would agree with, that part of the Christian mythos of Jesus being God.
So devil's advocate and heretic. I left that part out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
because you said it's central to Christianity, and I was like, you have to define it better before you say it's central to Christianity.
Well, but it isn't just the story that is central to most of what would fall under the pale of orthodoxy in Christianity. It is taken to be something that actually occurred. But
Yeah, that's right.
How important that is, I don't know. I hear where you're coming from.
Yeah. So that with that in mind, you can answer the question from there, I guess.
Yeah. Me. Okay. Well, yeah, that's an excellent question. So I would say the number one means by which the Muslim has to draw near to God are the divine names. So God's essence is absolutely transcendent and beyond human, the human ability to know his essence. But out of his mercy, he's revealed himself to human beings through divine names. Now, there's famously 99 names. That comes through a saying that's reported from the Prophet Muhammad. But actually, I mean, I can show you prayers where there are 1,000 names of God mentioned. And if you read the Quran, I don't know if either of you's ever tried to just sit down and read the Quran.
Long time ago.
I mean, usually the experience that people have, because it comes from a different genre of literature, is that it's kind of confusing, and there seems to be kind of a lack of order. But that's because Arabic literature had this very different way of ordering things that was thematic, and things are intertwined, and you don't tell, like, it's seen as poor form. Usually, it's like not very common to just tell a story. You know, it's okay to do that, and in chapter 12 of the Quran, that's the story is told from beginning to end. But things are intertwined, like thematically, so you'll get flashes of this story, and then you'll get the ending of that story, and then it'll refer to this. And so, but I was going to say, like, if you read the Quran, what ties it together are the divine names. The divine names come usually will wrap things up. Okay. And so you get this feeling that this whole book is really this attempt, is this kind of like attempt to let you know God through these holy names that he has. But then there's something else. In Islamic ethics, it's known that the divine names take on human forms in beautiful character traits. Okay. So, right, God is the merciful. Your duty is to embody that mercy in your life. God is the loving. Mm-hmm. Your duty is to. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And in embodying those names, you are becoming, in a sense, not godlike, but a mirror for God's beautiful attributes. The finest form of that is Muhammad. And so the way that you become closer to God and you really know God is by following him, imitating him, because he is. There's a saying from his wife Aisha that he is the walking Quran. He is the living Quran. You know, and so he is those divine names put into practice.
So she is, at least in her case, she's referring to Muhammad as a word of God.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that, but Muhammad's never called that. I mean, he didn't come to. I think that the birth of Jesus plays an important part in his being a word, but he's called light. In the Quran and in other sayings, he's called light, and God is called light. There's a famous verse of the Quran: God is the light of the heavens and the earth. There's the light of Muhammad that in some Sufi texts was associated with creation itself, like the creative energy. Controversial, but out there it exists. Well, anyways, to answer your question, yes, I think that the means to draw near to God and to know God and have a familiarity with God are the names. But there's an important practice in Sufism and elsewhere that knowledge and familiarity with God should be balanced by recognition of his transcendence and an idea that you can't know him. It's having these two in balance that's really important.
Yeah, and that's true in Christian theology as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And that kind of leads nicely into my next question. So I wanted to talk about the unknowns, the hiddenness of God. And certainly in Kabbalah and in Christian mysticism, they speak a lot about the hiddenness of God. And you started to bring this up earlier, so I realize now that that's a concept that is addressed in Islamic theology. But what purpose does God's hiddenness have? Like you just said, there needs to be a tension between relatability and hiddenness, transcendence.
Yeah.
How does that serve in this idea of relationship with God?
That's a really beautiful question. And the reason I particularly like it is that I've been trying not to use the word hadith, saying a saying. Mm-hmm. It's outside of the Quran, a saying outside of the Quran. This one is attributed to the prophet David, of David and Solomon, David and Goliath,
sure,
the biblical David. But it's, an Islamic saying, which is that David asked God, why did you create creation? Why bother? And God replies to him, Kuntu kanzan makhfiya. I was a hidden treasure, and I loved to be known. So I created creation that I might be known. I was a hidden treasure, and I loved to be known. I created creation so that I might be known. Well, the idea there is, I think it's pretty clear. It's exactly what you were saying, is that God's hiddenness precedes everything. But it was also that hiddenness was, you might want to say, it was the impetus really for God to want his beautiful traits to become manifest, So he was always generous, he was always merciful, he was always loving, but without a creation to be loving toward, merciful toward, something imperfect needed to be there.
Yeah. For
him to be known, manifest in that way. So in a way, his hiddenness is like the necessary prelude to his manifestness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So isn't it true too that in Islam, the goal of creation, I think I read this somewhere, maybe I just made it up.
Yeah.
I've been known to do that.
We'll see.
But maybe I got this from Mutahari.
Okay.
In his the paper we read on the problem of evil.
Yeah. Yeah.
It seemed that he believed that the goal of creation is the creation of free-willed beings, and to tie it into what you were saying, these free-willed beings can experience this hidden treasure.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that, and this is some of the Christian mystics I've read speak to this, that the hiddenness is also important because it's necessary if the creature is not only going to receive revelation about God, but also maintain their freedom in the process. So that faith, I guess you could call it, is necessary. And his hiddenness, it ensures that faith is part of the process. Otherwise, I guess as an example, if I've talked to, classes, what if God were to put a giant cross orbiting the earth, this is the truth, well, that would be overwhelming.
It'd be a compulsion.
Right. It'd be a compulsion. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And another Islamic, Quranic, verse that's famous is that there is no compulsion in religion.
Right.
So it seems to me that the hiddenness of God is important for that reason as well.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
I agree. I completely agree. Yeah. Especially from the Quranic perspective, there's an idea that God's signs are everywhere, but it's those who, the Quran puts it as applies reason, or, whose hearts can see, uses this kind of language. But basically it's those who apply a proper, thankful, awakened perspective to what's going on around them, that have this ability to perceive God all around them.
Yeah.
But then what happens upon death is the compulsion. That's the interesting thing about Islamic eschatology. Yeah. So now there's the element of choice. There's the element of, you see because you've made good decisions and you want to see. after death, everyone sees. God is no longer hidden.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to those,
this is similar to Eastern Orthodoxy. Actually, you can't run from God; He's everywhere. And once the veil is lifted, you may like it and you may not.
Well, no, that's a
so
very
you have
good
a
way
very
to put
hellish
it.
experience. In fact, if you don't want to see what reality is,
precisely, precisely, yeah, and you know, it's a pleasure, as you say. It'll be a beautiful experience for those who were prepared and who wanted to, and it won't be for those who didn't. Yeah, it's a really good way to look at it. Yeah.
Cool. So this next question definitely strays from the topic, but we've done that a lot. But I felt like I wanted to ask it because I felt it would be an irresponsible use of our time with you. If I didn't ask, because of the climate of fear in America concerning Islam. So this is the fastest growing, last I checked, this is the fastest growing religion in the United States, Islam is. And so a lot of Americans are concerned with what they perceive as an Islamic threat to their way of life. And those last two papers that we read, I was really humbled by my own ignorance and bias concerning the topics of jihad and Sharia law and the threat that they are perceived to have in Western culture. What can you tell us about these concepts, jihad, holy war, and Sharia law that might quell some people's fears?
Well, I could say a lot about them, but I mean the articles that you read, I mean, I think they put it really well. So on jihad, it's a very misunderstood concept. You know, when the term occurs in the Quran, jihad, it really does mean striving, and it could be striving in any way, striving to please God using your wealth, striving spiritually. There is reference in the Quran to fighting in God's way or fighting for God's cause. But if you look at them in context, and when I teach the class like in person, like it's easier for me to go through. Let's look at the different verses. Let's look at the scariest verses of the Quran, because there's certain like there's this verse that people will pull out, kill them wherever you find them, of the Quran. They'll just pull that out. And I'm like, okay, hold on, let's stop a second. Where let's look at the context of this verse and what comes before it and what comes after. And when you look at it, and I won't take the time to do it now, what you'll see is, first of all, it's talking about a wartime setting. Like the Quran is occurring within the historical period where.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you just angle your camera down a little bit?
Oh yeah. Why don't I do this? Here. Yeah. Sorry about that. How's that? Better?
Yeah. Yeah. That's okay. Good. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Sure.
So if you look at the verses of the Quran, like if you look at that one, it occurs within a wartime setting. It makes clear that you cannot initiate battle. You can't initiate the battle. It occurs within a context of a question that the Muslims had: are we allowed to fight if we're attacked in certain places that were designated as, let's say, no-fight zones? Because there was this pre-Islamic practice of certain places, sanctuaries, where you weren't allowed to shed blood. Mm-hmm. So there's this question of, are we allowed to fight there as well? And then when you begin to look at it, you're like, wait a minute, kill them, quote unquote, wherever you find them definitely doesn't mean like go around killing people wherever you can find them, and does mean something more along the lines of, in this particular climate that we are being attacked. The Muslims were being attacked in the Arabian Peninsula, in Medina and outside of Medina. If needs be, you can fight within the sanctuary, within, let's say, no fight zones. It's a very specific. Yeah. It's a very specific verse, right? That's been taken like, and in fact, if you begin to look at, I wouldn't say jihad, but even just, let's say, fighting for religion, or fighting with a sort of a religious purpose behind it, or godly, or divinely sanctioned fighting. Let's call it that.
Okay.
you look at the Quran's emphasis on protecting there's a clear verse that that you hate fighting. It's very clear that no one likes to fight, no one likes to kill, but if you don't defend yourselves, then you're not going to have monasteries, you're not going to have synagogues, you're not going to have mosques, and it talks about Christian and Jewish houses of worship as being necessary to protect, and we have some evidence that Muhammad saw his role as protecting Christian and Jewish houses of worship as well.
No kidding.
So, anyways, yeah,
like the Emir, and obviously
like the Emir Abdul Qadir, he's following that example. Yeah. Now, I'm no historian, so I'm not going to tell you that in early Islamic history this or that happened. But I do read the Quran, and I can tell you that the Quranic conception of, let's call it jihad, though it doesn't call it jihad. Jihad's what happens is in the Islamic legal tradition, they'll take a word and it'll become sort of a term that covers everything. So jihad eventually comes to mean divinely sanctioned battle. But in the Quran, it's never the kind of terrorism that you would see today. Has no basis in the Quran or in Islamic practice. Or in Islamic legal opinions. Valid Islamic legal opinions wouldn't sanction that kind of fighting. Mm-hmm. So really, the two are two separate things. When you see an act of terrorism, and if it's Islamist terrorism, it is what it is. It's terrorism, and we should and that's what we should call it. To call it jihad is an abuse of both of jihad, and it's giving way too much credit to those carrying it out. Now, the problem is they might think that it is, but I think we overestimate the level of literacy that these people have who are carrying out these things.
Yeah,
I saw this report that when ISIS was, ISIS had recruited some people, and it recruited a lot of people sort of locally in when they were in the Middle East and things like that. But there were some people who had flown from like England to join ISIS, and then they had done I guess they had access to their Amazon accounts, and the number one book that these people had been ordering before they went off to fight, I think it was in Syria, that was Islam for Dummies. Now,
that's awesome.
So I'm not trying to put anybody down, but at the same time, I think we really overestimate the kind of literacy. What's not happening is that someone's just reading the Quran and getting some sort of idea. There's a lot more politically, socially, culturally going on to create these terrorist groups.
Course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's the jihad part. In fact, if you want, I can go on to the Sharia part, but I'd like to give you a chance to comment.
Well, the thought that it's going through my head is, one of the students, one of his discussion comments was comparison with Westboro Baptist, rallies or whatever, and the illiteracy is definitely a problem. The ignorance. I mean, it's a problem in any culture, any religious group. We in Christianity we have this what would have been seen by the early fathers as absolute nonsense, like the I'm allowed to be more opinionated. But they would. So many of them would see this idea of hyper literalist interpretation, this hermeneutic that insists on every word being taken literally, as complete nonsense. And
really.
And the reality is that most of the most popular Christian movement in the United States, I guess you could generally categorize it as evangelicalism. Most of these pastors they're not schooled in any of this history, even interpretive history. They don't know about the church fathers. They don't know what they have to offer in terms of the history of the hermeneutic and that sort of thing. And it just ends up propagating these divisive ideas,
right?
And dogmatizing them, and
yeah. And I mean, another problem it is a problem. And another problem, maybe you'll agree with this. So we have these kind of neat categories that we deal with nowadays, where you have religion, you have state, you have war. War is the prerogative of the state. The problem is the holy texts that we refer to, they came to be in times when those categories didn't exist. The Bible and the Quran. Like you didn't have the state.
Yeah.
And the idea that religion was separate from politics or separate from warfare or separate there wasn't religion. There was just life, and life included your pious life. Your devotional life was connected to your the warfare, to governing the city or whatever. It was all, it was a different way of being. And the problem is, you can't read the present onto the past, and that's the main problem with the way people read the Quran. I think the way people read the Bible, you can use them, as you say, if you have this kind of hermeneutically sophisticated way of going back to the text and saying, this is my life now. These are the categories in which I live now. I'm going to read this text with that understanding and take things from it. Yeah. But you can't impose that on this or this on that. It's a big mess.
Right.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just quickly, the Sharia law, just a quick explanation of what that is and why this idea that it's a threat to the American way of life is really false.
Yeah. Okay. So without a doubt, there are groups around the world, especially Muslim majority countries, that are interested in applying Islamic law to some sort of government type thing. We use the word Islamist to describe that phenomenon. But I think that's a scary word that's a bit unnecessary. The reason is, how is that? Like, if you think of like a conservative Christian who's informed by the Bible in the way that they vote, or in the way that they, in their view of the American government, we don't have Christianists. We don't have the same. Not all Islamists have these kind of extreme points of view. Some of them are like, have more conservative traditional ways of life that they're trying to bring in through a legal system. Okay, so I'm saying I want to put that out there to say that does exist. The problem is, first of all, Sharia. Sharia means the sum of God's commands, divine commands. There is no book that contains it. Like you can't check out Sharia from the library.
Okay.
It doesn't exist in one place. There has to be interpretation. There's the sources of Sharia. The sources of Sharia, the Quran, the sayings of the Prophet, the community's point of view, reason, analogy. All of these things come together for a scholar who's able, for him, to be able to come to some sort of conclusion that, okay, this is what in this instance God would want. But what happened is, again, you have to go back to colonialism. When, especially the British, were ruling over a place, they were especially like India, they were interested in having a universal codified set of laws. To some extent, that's justified. How else do you govern, right?
Yeah.
Sharia hadn't worked like that before. You didn't really have a codified, again, as I say, Sharia. It was always left up to the judge. It was always peculiar to your environment. If there was a ruling, it wasn't codified in that way. So the British take an interest in bringing Sharia elements into a codified, like Indian law. And actually, that's kind of like the birth of the concept of Sharia law. Okay. And like, for example, the blasphemy laws in Pakistan, they come from that time, where they were interested in having, like, let's say, Hindu and Muslim laws become this kind of universal. And so Muslims themselves took that up and became interested in it. But frankly, does it work? Remember that gap we were talking about between present and past?
Yeah.
It keeps coming in when it comes in with Sharia.
Of course.
Because, it's not that Sharia doesn't have the ability to deal with modern issues. It does. But the question is, is there room in the Sharia for it to govern? Muslims? Is there room in Sharia to govern non-Muslims? This is a really complicated topic. So that's the one end of it. Now let's get to America. Most Muslim Americans that have been surveyed, you can look on Pew, and check this out, are in no way interested in having Sharia become a part of American law. A. B. Let's say there's like 2%, 5%, I don't remember what it is, a very small part who would like to, let's say, in their city, bring Islamic divorce and marriage laws into that city or something like that. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the U.S. Constitution has done pretty well in making in its the First Amendment, in its First Amendment and otherwise, in making sure that none of that could ever happen. Mm-hmm. You have to really let your imagination run wild to imagine a scenario where Islamic law somehow would become this major part of American society. Muslim Americans aren't interested in it in that way. They're interested in Sharia, but they're interested in the Sharia as religion in the modern conception. How do I pray? How do I fast? Maybe how do I marry personally, but not how do I create a law that other people would abide by.
Not the rule of law in the land kind of thing.
No, there isn't a... And then also, there just aren't... On top of all that, there just aren't that many Muslims in America. I can't remember the number. What is it? It's very low. I mean, I don't want to misspeak. I should have
remember either.
Yeah.
Incredibly low. So yeah, go ahead.
I think there's I think where this fear stems from. Again, I'm infinitely ignorant compared to what you two, and what you're talking about. So correct me again. What is this? The Sharia law? Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that fear stems from how many Americans base what they think the law should be on by their Christian beliefs.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Why for how long was it that a marriage could only be between a man and a woman?
Right.
Well, because God said so, and a man can marry a man.
Right.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And so it stems from a lot of they have laws from Christian beliefs, and if another religion's coming in, they want to do the same thing. So they're placing their mentality on another culture, on another religion.
Well, that's the threat we had talked about earlier. Yeah, I could see that. And the reason I like using, we use Sacred Ground, right? Abu Patel. I don't know if maybe we haven't gotten there yet. But the reason I like what Abu Patel does...
I'm afraid to say.
He either doesn't remember or...
Caught live on camera. But the reason I like the Abu Patel reading in Sacred Ground is that he does just this very clear job of showing the parallels between what's happening with the Sharia scare and what happened with the Catholic scare, and the parallels between two. That most of us I'm getting up there, but I don't remember that. Right. I mean, it was a while ago. So it's easy for people to forget, but what John F. Kennedy, the kinds of accusations that came.
That's true.
And then you look at all these wait, what was going on with with these amendments banning alcohol, the prohibition, and it really was a Catholic scare and a concern that somehow that the Catholic way of life and the Catholic Church and the Pope would somehow take over. And of course that didn't happen because of what you could call rule of law, the Constitution, and also a lack of interest, a real lack of interest among American Catholics, who are way more American Catholics. I mean, I don't want to speak in a general sense, but are way more Protestant than I think a lot of Protestants realize. There's just we don't realize how Protestant all Americans are, whether Muslim, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant. And being American and these Protestant, the kind of some of the Protestant values are just culturally fused together so much that,
Yeah. That's one of the things that led Jordan Peterson not too long ago to say to Sam Harris, "You're a believer and you didn't know it."
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's just because of the values that have been infused, that he subscribes to, but then claims that there's no God, But
yeah.
Well, this has been really interesting. I've had so much fun doing this, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with us. Maybe we can do it again sometime. And
I would love that. I had a great time, actually. Both of you, really. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed learning from both of you. Just sitting here and
No, you always have. You really do. You have. He really does have some good insights. He's definitely a very highly rational thinker.
Yeah.
So anyway, this has been Cogent Thoughts with Dr. Zargar and Chris Lemaster. I'm Brett Watson. Thanks for watching.